Beneath the ringing church bells of London, women learned that a whisper could mean the scaffold. The winter fog curled low over the Thames, carrying the scent of coal smoke and damp stone, muffling footsteps until they seemed to rise from nowhere. Lanterns flickered on crooked doorways where rats scurried in the shadows. In those narrow alleys, fear lived like a second skin. The reigns of James and then Charles had braided law with superstition so tightly that no one could tell where justice ended and madness began. Plague carts rattled through the streets, their wheels slick with rain and death, while the cries of the sick mingled with sermons that promised damnation to any soul who strayed. Women clutched charms beneath their shawls, praying their neighbors would not glance too long at the herbs in their baskets. Eleanor Whittle had never thought of herself as dangerous. She was a quiet woman with steady hands and a love of growing things. Her garden in Southwark brimmed with lavender and rue, foxglove and marigold, each leaf carrying centuries of whispered cures. Mothers brought her infants burning with fever, and she would brew teas fragrant with chamomile and honey. Sailors came to her for poultices when the river damp had gnawed at their lungs. But after the stillbirth of the baker's child, the murmurs began. Someone had seen a black cat slip through her window at dusk. Another claimed she wandered the churchyard at midnight, humming to herself while the moon lay cold and pale. These fragments of gossip hardened like frost, and soon her name traveled faster than the plague winds. One evening, as a crimson sunset bled across the rooftops, the constable arrived. His knock was a blunt warning. Behind him, a cluster of neighbors stared as though already certain of her guilt. Eleanor felt their judgment like a noose tightening. They found no charms, no spells, only the smell of herbs and the soft rustle of drying leaves, yet their eyes told her the verdict had been decided long before they crossed her threshold. She was led through the market square while boys tossed stones that clattered like hail against the cobbles. The first ordeal came swiftly. They bound her to the ducking stool, a rough wooden chair fastened to the end of a long beam above the Black River. The crowd gathered in a tide of breath and jeers, faces blurred by mist and lantern glow. Water slapped the pier with a sound like slow applause. Eleanor's wrists were tied so tightly she felt her pulse hammer against the rope. When they lowered her, the river closed over her head like a coffin lid. Cold knifed into her bones. She kicked, lungs screaming, while above her the world dimmed into a dull, green silence. Hauled up gasping, she tasted salt and soot before the beam creaked again and sent her plunging back into darkness. Innocence, they said, would float. Guilt would drown. The crowd cheered each descent. Days later, her bruised body bore the weight of a new punishment. They fitted her with the scold's bridle, an iron cage that locked over her head, a cruel bit pressing her tongue until she could scarcely breathe. Rust tasted of blood at the corners of her mouth. Children followed as she was paraded through the lanes, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Market women turned their eyes away, yet none dared speak. The bells tolled for the dying as plague fires burned in distant courtyards, smoke rising like unholy incense. The city reeked of fear, and Eleanor's silence became another sermon. Weeks blurred into a fevered haze. London itself seemed possessed, a city of masks and mourning where even the healthy were shadows. The great plague swelled like a tide no prayer could hold back. Red crosses marked doors where entire families lay cold inside. Churchyards overflowed, and the night air throbbed with the clatter of death carts. Eleanor was released, though not forgiven. People crossed themselves when she passed, muttering that she had bargained with the pestilence. She walked alone through streets emptied of laughter, the river carrying the faint sob of distant bells. Then, one rain-slicked dawn, she was gone. Some whispered she had fled across the channel, borne away by sympathetic sailors. Others claimed she had been taken in secret to the pest house on Greyfriars Lane, where plague victims were bricked behind walls to die unseen. Neighbors remembered a single cry echoing through the fog that night, cut short as though swallowed by stone. No burial record was kept. No parish register bore her name again. Her cottage stood empty, herbs withering to dust, the black cat a phantom no one could catch. London healed in fits and starts. The bells kept ringing, trades returned, and gossip sought new prey. But sometimes, when the river mist crawls up from the water and the moonlight lays a pale road across the rooftops, an old woman is said to walk the banks, her face hidden, her steps soundless, a shadow of the century's quiet cruelty. And though the city has forgotten, the silence she leaves behind is deeper than the toll of any bell, a warning carried on the damp night air that justice can drown as easily as the accused. Snow hushed the Massachusetts woods, but the meeting house roared with accusation. Frost clung to the eaves like silver claws while the sky hung low and colorless, a lid over the restless village. Beneath it, voices rose in fevered prayer, each word sharp enough to pierce the marrow. The winter of 1692 had pressed Salem into a single heartbeat of fear, where every creak of timber or cough of wind might carry the devil's name. Mary Carter tightened her shawl as she stepped from her farmhouse that morning, the breath of her cows pluming in the barn behind her. She had given bread and a warm blanket to a wandering Abenaki child the week before, a simple act of mercy. But mercy was dangerous when neighbors sought signs of secret pacts. Already she had caught the glances, women who once traded seeds with her now whispering as she passed, men pausing mid-chop to watch her with narrowed eyes. The air itself seemed brittle with suspicion. The accusations came like a sudden frost. A cluster of children convulsed in the parsonage, limbs jerking as if puppeteered by unseen hands. Between sobs they named Mary. Ministers thundered from the pulpit, declaring that the devil's brides walked among them. Each sermon braided scripture with dread until reason frayed to threads. Mary protested softly, but her voice was drowned by the congregation's rising cries. Her kindness to the native child became proof of unholy alliances. Her herbal teas for winter coughs, once welcomed, turned to evidence of forbidden craft. Even the silence of the forest around her home was recast as a cloak for midnight meetings with the damned. They came for her before dawn, boots crunching through new snow. Cold iron shackles bit her wrists as lanterns threw long, trembling shadows across the drifted fields. Neighbors she had fed and comforted followed the constable, faces rigid in the pale light. She walked without struggle, the sky bruising with the first hint of morning. The jail awaited, a squat timber building whose stone floor exhaled the chill of the earth. Inside, darkness wrapped her like a second skin. The air smelled of mold and despair, of straw long soaked by tears. The first ordeal was the pressing. They laid her on the hard ground of a barn converted for judgment, a place where grain once rested safe from rain. A heavy board was lowered across her chest. Stones followed, first small, then larger, each one a gray sentence. Her breath came shallow as the weight gathered, ribs groaning like old timbers in a storm. Confess, they demanded. Name your conspirators. She said nothing. Silence was the only dignity left. The world narrowed to the slow crush of granite and the cold bite of winter seeping through the floor. Somewhere outside, a crow called once and then fell quiet. When they found her still alive, they dragged her back to the jail, its windows crusted with ice. Nights there were a punishment of their own. Chains cut the skin of her ankles. The straw pallet offered no warmth. Other women labored in the darkness, some heavy with child, their breath fogging the frigid air as rats skittered in the corners. One young prisoner birthed a stillborn infant on the frozen stones, her sobs muffled by the walls while the jailer pretended not to hear. Mary held her through the silence, whispering a hymn until the girl's tears finally ceased. The final dawn came clear and merciless. Gallows Hill waited, its bare trees etched black against the snow. Mary walked the narrow path with her head high, the rope already stiff with frost in the hangman's hands. Villagers lined the slope, their faces pinched by the cold and by something darker, a hunger for certainty in a season when God felt distant. She met their eyes, not with anger but with a sorrow that seemed to reach beyond the mortal hour. When the noose settled around her neck, she began to sing. Her voice cracked in the freezing air yet carried a fragile beauty, a hymn for those who would never be heard. The stool was kicked, the hymn ended, and the world returned to its uneasy silence. Snow fell again before the body cooled, soft flakes erasing footprints, covering the rope's harsh memory. By spring, the records of her trial disappeared from the town ledger. Pages were torn or perhaps never written, as if the earth itself conspired to hide the crime. Children who had screamed her name grew to adulthood and spoke of other things. Houses changed hands, fields were plowed, and the gallows rotted into soil. But on nights when the wind moves through Salem like a restless spirit, some claim to hear a faint melody drifting over the hill, a woman's hymn riding the frozen air. They say it lingers only a heartbeat before vanishing into the dark, a reminder of a winter when fear became law and a kind heart was enough to summon the hangman. The snow melted, the spring came, and the truth remained buried deeper than her unmarked grave.